Some laws are impossible to break, like the law of gravity. And those of us with MS realize that gravity is not always our friend. But another law that we seem powerless as a society to be able to break is the law of unintended consequences. Hello and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam. I've been living with multiple sclerosis for over 39 years. And on this channel, we've looked at a lot of what the latest understanding of MS might be, what the research is telling us, what the science shows. But we are realizing that the two things that are elusive, even though there are many new treatments and many new discoveries, still the two things that elude us are the cause of MS and how to cure it. One of the things that we really haven't talked a lot about, at least not as a focus of our discussion, is the possible influence of environmental factors on the development of multiple sclerosis. I just recently saw an article that I found very interesting on a possible link between an environmental toxin that's commonly used around the home and probably more so during the COVID pandemic, and how that might have contributed to the development of multiple sclerosis. So of course I had to look into that, and I'll take you along with me as we take a look. I saw this article on March 27, 2024 in Multiple Sclerosis News Today, which I'll tell you has been a treasure trove of up-to-date information about what's going on in the world of MS. And it is titled, "Exposure to Household Chemicals Harms Myelin-Making Cells. Compounds are found in disinfectants in use since COVID-19 outbreak." So talk about unintended consequences. I remember when stores didn't even have any hand sanitizer because everybody had gobbled it up and was hoarding it. And now we find that it might actually have weakened our resistance to MS. Let's find out more about that. They say that two types of chemicals in household disinfectants and furniture can disrupt the development of oligodendrocytes, the brain cells chiefly responsible for making myelin, a new study shows. So I guess to be fair, it's not just the hand sanitizer that's at fault here, possibly even things that we use to clean our furniture and probably other household chemicals might do the same thing. It's just that use increased dramatically, probably of both the hand sanitizer and household cleaning products, since most of us were stuck at home all the time. And what else could you do but clean your house, especially since living in a dirty house 24/7 can get a little old. So that's probably what happened. The exposure rates went way up, and all of a sudden they saw some effects. The finding suggests that exposure to these chemicals may be a risk factor for disorders related to myelin, such as multiple sclerosis, where the immune system launches an inflammatory attack that damages myelin, and oligodendrocytes have limited ability to repair the damage. Loss of oligodendrocytes underlies multiple sclerosis and other neurological diseases. We now show that specific chemicals in consumer products can directly harm oligodendrocytes, representing a previously unrecognized risk factor for neurological disease. Paul Tassar, PhD, co-author of the study at Case Western Reserve University's School of Medicine in Ohio, said in a news release. The results of this study, "Pervasive Environmental Chemicals Impair Oligodendrocyte Development," which was published in Nature Neuroscience, might help explain a missing link in how some neurological diseases arise, said Aaron Cohn, a graduate student at Case Western and lead author. People are exposed as part of modern life to thousands of different chemicals, most of which have safety profiles that aren't fully understood. The increased exposure to these chemicals may be associated with the rising prevalence of certain brain diseases, which cannot be explained solely by genetic and other environmental factors. Very few commonly used chemicals have been tested for their impact on oligodendrocytes, which are highly vulnerable to environmental chemical exposure, leading researchers here to screen these myelin-making cells by exposing them to more than 1,800 chemicals to see if any of them interfered with oligodendrocyte growth. Neurotoxic effects of chemical exposures in MS, according to the article. This type of screening is a powerful tool to prioritize chemicals of concern and identify environmental triggers of disease on the basis of their toxic effects to relevant neural cell types, the researchers wrote. Most of the chemicals had no effect on oligodendrocytes, and 22 stimulated the growth of these cells. But more than 300 chemicals were identified as being either toxic to the cells or inhibiting their growth. The toxic effects of the most potent chemicals were validated in further experiments, and in two classes of common chemicals seemed to most affect oligodendrocytes in mice and human cell models. Quaternary ammonium compounds, which are present in many disinfectants and personal care products, and organophosphate flame retardants, which are used in furniture and electronics. The chemicals weren't particularly toxic to any other type of cell tested, however. Quite interesting, I think. And that makes me wonder about some of the shampoos. I remember as a young person, they started to realize that some of the compounds that were just routinely included in most of the shampoos that we buy were not good for us. I remember in particular, formaldehyde was in there. So if ammonia is in some of our cleaning products, that is not at all surprising, since ammonia actually is a very common household cleaner. We found that oligodendrocytes, but not other brain cells, are surprisingly vulnerable to quaternary ammonium compounds and organophosphate flame retardants, Cohn said. Previous studies have shown that organophosphate flame retardants are often detectable in the blood and other bodily fluids in children. And I've been reading quite a bit about that. A lot of the things that we thought we were doing to help our kids be safe turn out they have other risks and dangers that perhaps are worse because the probability of them causing problems is higher. Yes, the consequence of being in a fire is very dire, but the consequence of being exposed every single day to these organophosphate flame retardants is likely to have quite a large risk of its own in the long run. In fact, in data on more than 1,700 children ages 3 to 11, collected by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, more than 99% of children had a chemical called BDCIPP in their urine, which is a marker of exposure to the TDCIPP, organophosphate flame retardant. Analyses of this study showed children with higher urine BDCIPP were significantly more likely to show signs of neurological issues such as needing special education assistance in school. These data indicate strong evidence of a positive association between organophosphate flame retardant exposure and abnormal neurodevelopment, the researchers wrote. Quaternary compounds, meanwhile, have become much more present since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. These chemicals are present in more than half of the disinfectants registered for killing the viruses that cause COVID-19. The compounds showed toxic effects to oligodendrocytes even at very low levels, similar to expected levels in the blood of children exposed to these disinfectants. Further experiments in mice showed these quaternary compounds can cross from the blood into the brain, which the researchers said raises significant health concerns for neurodevelopmental toxicity. The scientists called for more research into the possible consequences of exposure to the chemicals, noting that solid data about the risks are vital to inform risk reduction policies. Our findings suggest that more comprehensive scrutiny of the impacts of these common household chemicals on brain health is necessary, Tassar said. We hope our work will contribute to informed decisions regarding regulatory measures or behavioral interventions to minimize chemical exposure and protect human health. Well, I was intrigued enough by this, I decided to go out and take a look to see what else I might find just on the subject of environmental toxins and the development of neurological problems like multiple sclerosis. I found an article at the National Library of Medicine website, which of course I'll link below. It was published in 2019, April of 2019, so a few years ago, but quite relevant. It's lifestyle and environmental factors in multiple sclerosis. And the real reason I wanted to include this is because if we scroll down to the table, that's quite a ways down, the table is a summary of established and tentative lifestyle or environmental factors and their potential interaction with multiple sclerosis human leukocyte antigen risk genes. And so let's just take a look at some of these things that they've listed here. So you can see here there's a bunch of factors listed and the odds ratio of those having an effect. The columns I think we can focus on, though, are whether the effect happens mainly during adolescence. And I think that's important to note because the nervous system is still very much in development. The brain, in particular, very much in development during adolescence and even into early adulthood. So anything that seems to have an effect at that time could cause lasting problems. Finally, that far right column, if it has a plus sign, it means that the immune system is indeed affected by exposure to that factor. So looking quickly at this list, you've got smoking, not necessarily showing an effect mainly during adolescence, which is good, but it definitely does. As you see, it has the plus sign in the far right column. So the nervous system is indeed affected by smoking. The Epstein-Barr serology, so if your blood tests positive for the presence of Epstein-Barr virus, the effect is actually prevalent mainly during adolescence. And again, positive immune system implied. Vitamin D less than 50 nanomoles, that's something that doctors have begun testing more for now, especially for those of us who have MS. And as you can see here, it probably does affect adolescents because, again, the brain is in development. And if it's deprived of key essential nutrients in adolescence, that's definitely not good for development. And then a plus sign in the far right column again. Adolescent obesity or a BMI greater than 27. Of course, yes, in the adolescent column and plus in the far right column. And then night work. Now that's an interesting one. It does actually affect mainly in adolescents. Young people, they seem to feel like they're pretty invincible. But they may be doing themselves a disservice if they decide they're going to take work on the night shift. And then, of course, in the far right column, a plus sign. I think actually we can just pretty much assume they're all going to be plus signs in the far right column, right? So let's just not even worry about that one anymore. Low sun exposure. That one I've done videos on. It does seem that vitamin D itself is not the only or even the main reason why MS seems more prevalent in certain parts of the world. It might have to do with the lack of sun exposure. And again, it probably affects the brains of adolescents and young people more than it does adults. Infectious mononucleosis, that is definitely a disease of young people. And as you can see, it does indeed affect brain development. Passive smoking, so sitting in somebody else's smoke. No, well, that's nice to see a no. It doesn't predominantly affect adolescents. So no matter what age you are, it's not good to be sitting in somebody else's smoke, but it isn't primarily something that affects young people. And then oral tobacco or nicotine is unknown, or at least it was in 2019. Alcohol, again, unknown. And coffee, again, unknown. But they all have plus signs in the far right column, and at least at that time, they were believed to adversely affect the immune system. Let's just skip down to the conclusion where they say that lifestyle or environmental factors affecting MS are increasingly defined. Combining genetics and environmental factors have contributed to understanding MS. Factors interacting with MS risk genes, primarily HLA risk genes, can be argued to share etiologic pathways underlying the disease, additionally arguing for their action on the immune system. This is applicable to smoking, EBV infection, and adolescent obesity. The mechanism for understanding is in its early stages, although thus far the vast majority of defined factors can be traced to effects on the immune system, similar to the genetic predisposing elements, and strongly arguing for a primary role of the peripheral immune system driving MS. Factors that trigger disease can increasingly be incorporated into practical healthcare and even prevention, in particular for individuals at increased risk for MS, especially if there is a familial aggregation. Well, as you can see, there are a lot of possible environmental toxins. So as we think about that, we quickly realize, though, it is not practical, it's not even possible to live our entire lives without exposure to something, right? Even if we think it's perfectly innocuous, it might not be in the long run. But what do we know? We're still learning about the effect of things. I know that a lot of times, and you even see this in your own life, something you do to solve a problem that's very pressing and has to be dealt with oftentimes ends up having other consequences that you wish you'd known about ahead of time. I think almost the definition of a new technology is something whose dangers haven't been discovered yet. Even so, I don't think that we can live our lives being paranoid about things. As we learn new information, it's good to take that into account. One of the things to remember is that exposure to something one time or only a few times over a long period of time is probably not going to be sufficient to cause problems, any more than getting sunburned one time is going to cause cancer, but repeated skin damage might end up doing exactly that. So we just need to be a little bit cautious and sensible about the things that we put on our bodies, take into our bodies, expose ourselves to, whatever. Read the labels on the chemicals that you use to do various household tasks, even things that you think are pretty innocuous, like soap and shampoo. Just check them out. If you see something on the label that's unfamiliar to you, you can look it up on the internet. Every search engine can give you basic information of what you need to know, and then make a decision based on that. I know that an awful lot of information now is telling us that the sodium lauryl sulfates that are in shampoos aren't good. If we look at every bottle of shampoo, pretty much we're going to see that in it. There are things that we can make choices about in our lives. Making our own household cleaners instead of buying store-bought ones that contain chemicals we've probably never heard of, and we certainly don't know what effect they're likely to have on us. But the more we stick to the basics, the things that have been around for a long time, whose effects are pretty well known, I think the better off we're going to be. But like I said, we can't avoid risk at all. And in the meantime, it's a lot harder to take down a healthy person than a sick person. So, of course, what we're going to do is keep our general health just as strong as it possibly can be. And then every environmental toxin that hits us is going to have to contend with a healthy body. And that may be enough to keep it from causing us any further trouble. So that's all I have for you for now. So until I see you again in my next video, do take really good care of yourself.